Thank you all for joining us today for the fourth installment in our Fresh Fare tutorial series, When and What to Share, Understanding HEAL Data. Sorry. The poll is popping up. Okay. I apologize for that. Thank you for joining us. When and What to Share, Understanding HEAL Data Sharing Requirements. Next slide, please. We'll be using a few polls today, as you probably saw pop up, to gather your feedback. If you see one pop up on your screen, please take a moment to submit your choice. Okay, next slide, please. Today's tutorial will provide guidance on when and how to share data into a HEAL-compliant repository. Our tutorial session will begin with a presentation from HEAL steward Sarah Meyer, who will provide an overview of NIH data sharing policy while focusing on HEAL-specific data sharing requirements. It will be followed by lightning talks from Sophia Lafferty-Hess and Desi Kirilova, who will be sharing their experience with data curation and repository deposition. Following these presentations, we will have 2 breakout rooms where you can dive into data submission questions with subject matter experts. The tutorial will conclude after the breakout sessions. Please note that the first part of the tutorial is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we are joined today by our 3 presenters. Sarah Meyer is a data steward in the data management group at RENCI. Sarah provides subject matter expertise and technical support for the HEAL Data Stewardship Group on data curation, reuse, and harmonization. She has experience in public health program evaluation, human subject translational research, community-based research, data management, HIPAA compliance, and technical training. Sophia Lafferty-Hess, MS MPA, is a senior research data management consultant at Duke University Libraries. She specializes in data management best practices, including organizing, documenting, citing, archiving, and sharing data. Sophia has supported the curation and publishing of research data for over 10 years, with a background working with the Social Science Data Archive. At Duke, she serves on the Product Council for the Duke Research Data Repository Program and is a curator within the Data Curation Network. She earned a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Classical Studies from the University of Arkansas and a Master of Science of Information Science and Master of Public Administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Desi Kirilova was trained as a social scientist and in her current role works to educate and assist social science, biomedical, and other researchers interested in making their research more transparent and their data as ethically shareable as possible. She also researches the policies and practices of various academic stakeholders, which include researchers, funders, journals, the IRB, that impact data sharing. More broadly, she publishes and presents on topics around data management and sharing, qualitative data curation, the ethics of data sharing and reuse, and research transparency in the social behavioral domain. Next slide, please. At this time, I will pass the presentation over to Sarah Meyer.
Thank you, Lizelle. Today, we will begin by exploring how the HEAL initiative aligns with the NIH data management policy and sharing policies, overarching goals, and timelines. The NIH data management and sharing policy seeks to make scientific data widely available and accessible while safeguarding the privacy and confidentiality of research participants. This policy applies to all NIH-funded and NIH-conducted research that generates scientific data. Researchers are expected to maximize the appropriate sharing of data, defined as data deemed essential by the scientific community to validate and replicate findings. Any exceptions to this study must be explicitly addressed within the study's data management and sharing plan, known as the DSMP. In addition, researchers must also ensure compliance with requirements for other federal policies that apply to any types of data that are collected during the research, which may include, but are not limited to, consent under the NIH Genomic Data Sharing Policy, handling of sensitive data, considerations for populations at risk for social or cultural stigma, regulations for substance use disorder patient records. The HEAL stewards have developed a tool available on healdatafair.org to help identify policies related to specific sensitive data types. While this tool is a valuable resource, it should be used as a reference and not as formal guidance for sharing sensitive data or specific data types. The timing for sharing data within the research data lifecycle is clearly defined in the NIH data management and sharing policy. Scientific data should be shared as early as possible, but no later than. For peer-reviewed publications, data must be made accessible by the time the article is available in print or in its electronic format. For unpublished findings, data must be shared by the end of the performance period or extended performance period if there is a no-cost extension granted. This includes data from preprints, conference proceedings, and negative findings. In some cases, there are special requirements, and NIH policies or specific funding opportunities may require earlier data sharing. In such instances, those timelines take precedence and must be adhered to over general NIH policies. So one of the key goals of the NIH data management and sharing policy, along with the HEAL data ecosystem, is to promote the long-term sharing of data through the FAIR principles. These are what are known as findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And one of the components of that are what we use with the HEAL compliant data repositories. This is where data is deposited into a HEAL compliant data repository. This includes all HEAL scientific data. These repositories are designed to store research data long after a project has concluded, and it ensures continued accessibility. There are 1,000 data repositories or more available, and the HEAL stewards have identified those that meet specific criteria. Repositories that have a suitability for study data, that included data governance, that include costs for both current research teams and future teams to access the study data. Those that have a future expansion plans and persistence, these are repositories that have a sustainable long-term plan and are financially viable, and repositories that align with the FAIR principles. The list of compliant repositories is regularly reviewed and updated by HEAL stewards. Our first lightning talk today will cover data packaging and data curation steps to prepare data to be deposited into a repository. Our second lightning talk today will be focused on what repository services are provided and how the qualitative data repository operationalizes the responsible publication and sharing of multiple data types. The qualitative data repository, or QDR, is on the HEAL compliant list of repositories. Fair data sharing enables vital scientific and community-driven reasons to prioritize data sharing, specifically enhancing reproducibility. This enables researchers to verify findings and to build on them. It strengthens credibility and the robustness of scientific research. Accelerating new discoveries, researchers across disciplines can identify patterns, test new hypotheses, and make novel breakthroughs more quickly. Fair data sharing fosters collaboration with open data between institutions, countries, and disciplines, which contribute to a more interconnected and dynamic scientific community. Maximizing impact and the return on investment ensures that the time and the resources, which are considerable, that are invested into research yield the greatest possible benefit, advancing both science and public health. Supporting transparency and accountability. Publicly available data promotes transparency in research, safeguarding the integrity of the scientific process and public's trust. And broadly, empowering the broader community, even beyond the scientific field. Shared data empowers patients, advocacy groups, policymakers, and educators to make informed decisions that lead to better outcomes. By embracing these advantages, data sharing fosters a more open and efficient and innovative research ecosystem, one that maximizes the return on NIH's investment and advances policy and public health for everyone. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sophia Lafferty-Hess.
Thanks, Sarah. So as introduced, I'm Sophia Lafferty-Hess. I'm a research data management consultant at Duke University. And sorry. Sorry, I messed up my view. Give me just a second. Okay. I'm going to apologize for this. Okay. All right, sorry about that. All right, so today I'm going to provide some of the basics for packaging or curating your data for making it publicly accessible via a repository. So this can be a multifaceted topic. So my goal in this very short time frame is to provide some general good practices and point to specific resources and examples that you can revisit. Next slide, please. So the visual on the screen gives a nice high-level overview of the process, which obviously begins when you first start collecting or generating data, and then ends after uploading your data into a repository, and then for HEAL researchers, submitting your metadata to the HEAL discovery platform. So this comes from a useful HEAL guide on packaging data for a repository, and I encourage you to check it out after this session. Next slide, please. So to dig more deeply into this topic, one of the first steps after actually selecting an appropriate repository, which I'm not really going to discuss much today, but Sarah already mentioned some of the HEAL resources, is making sure you understand and review the actual expectations and requirements for that repository. So some repositories, such as generalist repositories like Zenodo or Harvard Dataverse or Figshare, they may not have many specific requirements, but more specialized repositories such as the NIH-sponsored repositories or disciplinary specific repositories can be more prescriptive. So the repository might have requirements regarding standard variables or common data elements, how to format your data, or what metadata needs to be supplied. So it is good to review any documentation prior to even collecting data to avoid having to retrofit later. Often you'll find this information on either submission guidelines or resources pages or potentially within the FAQ. And then on this slide, I also have called out a nice HEAL resource that's a use case for submission into the Sequence Read Archive to understand what's expected when submitting there. Next slide. So next is having a good idea of actually which data you'll be sharing via the repository. And often this decision is guided by your data type, your data sharing goals, and the norms of your field of study or discipline. So some researchers may be sharing raw data. Some researchers may just be sharing their process or analysis data sets. If working with human participants, sharing your de-identified or anonymized data, or potentially even just subsets of data. I'll also just put a plug in that it's good to share your code and scripts as well as any specialized software or tools to help enhance the reproducibility of your findings. So again, while this is pretty context specific, I think a helpful guiding question can be, what data would others need access to in order to effectively reproduce my results or extend my research? Next slide. You'll also want to identify what format your data will be in when shared. So ideally, it is recommended to use open, standardized file formats or formats that are really common in your field to broaden interoperability and reuse by others. So for example, let's say you're using a commercial statistical program for analysis, such as Stata, SPSS, or SAS. What we would recommend is still archiving and sharing that statistical program version, but also having a derivative in something like CSV that is open and standard and makes it more widely accessible to everyone, even people that don't have Stata. Next slide. Another important, or what I would say is really essential step, is generating associated documentation and metadata. So these are pieces of context that allow others to properly interpret and work with your data. So some common types of documentation include study level metadata. So that's the actual descriptive information that helps with discovery. So things like your title, your description, your keywords, your author list. README files, which are usually plain text files that help situate an end user to your data sets. Code books or data dictionaries, protocols, questionnaires, instruments. And again, another example pictured here is a template and the user guide that's required for use for creating a code book when you're submitting to the NICHD- repository. Next slide. And so again, last but not least, and something that I think is particularly important to plan for early, are applying any data standards. So again, these are more often required by certain specialist repositories, but generally if there is a standard in your field, it's good to use it even if submitting to a generalist repository. So these standards help to support data harmonization, interoperability, and meta-analysis. So one example is BIDS, which is the Brain Imaging Data Structure. So this is a standard for the organization of neuroimaging data. And the use of BIDS is actually required when submitting data to OpenNeuro. And OpenNeuro is also a HEAL compliant repository and is specifically built for the sharing of neuroimaging data. Next slide. So as you plan for data sharing, you'll really want to think about, well, when do I need to deposit my data? This can be impacted by grant timelines, as Sarah already mentioned, as well as your journal timelines, the repository timelines, and your own project timelines and resources. So for instance, some journals require that persistent identifier, a DOI, to the data in the repository be provided when the article is formally accepted and at that kind of page proof stage. Other journals might actually request that the data be available during the peer review process. So it's just really important to kind of understand those policies and how they may affect your data deposition timelines. Another big thing to understand are those repository timelines. So some disciplinary or NIH-sponsored repositories may require the submission of data or other documents, such as institutional certifications, at particular milestones, or they may need significant amounts of time for data curation or processing. So for instance, again, NICHD- indicates in their documentation that data should be submitted 4 to 6 months prior to the expected public release date. Last slide, please. So finally, I didn't really touch upon the impact of sensitivity of your data and how that might affect these processes, but I believe Desi's going to discuss more about some sensitive data considerations in her talk. But as we know, there are cases where data cannot be shared for ethical or legal reasons. So then you might consider sharing other pieces of your research outputs or workflow. So things like aggregate reports, summary statistics, code or scripting files in places like GitHub, associated documentation or metadata, or your protocols. So my final thought I'll leave you with is, even if your actual data cannot be shared, you can think more broadly about ways to make your research more transparent and reproducible. So thank you for your time, and now I'm going to pass it over to Desi.
Yes, hi, thank you, Sophia, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar by the always helpful HEAL Data Stewards. I am the Senior Curation Specialist who leads curation at the Qualitative Data Repository, where we're very happy to be one of the HEAL compliant repositories. My goal here today is indeed, as Sophia just alluded to, that talk about the specific cases where maybe the full data set cannot be shared, and what are some other forms that data or portions of the data can nonetheless be shared as. And again, I come from the particular perspective of a qualitative data repository. So I will also give you some examples, because often people ask for those and it's not very clear what aggregate data should look like, could look like in the qualitative context. But I hope from the examples and the other general comments I make that you can find relevant points to whatever types of data it is that you collect as part of your typical studies. With a little bit kind of broader starting point, I want to start by saying that data sharing should not be seen as an all or nothing prospect. That yes, sometimes under certain circumstances, primarily due to sensitivity with the participation of human participants, but not always, and there could be other considerations why all the data cannot be shared. But that does not immediately lead to the conclusion that none of the data can be shared. Sorry, next slide, please. I forgot to ask for that. So what could then be done? And Sophia gave some ideas of providing documentation, which is always a great start. It still allows others to trace your research process, to understand whatever results you publish on the basis of the process, even if they don't see the full data set. So documentation is certainly great, but there could be components of the data that also maybe can be presented for public view, even if the full data are not. So here are some examples that go all the way from, publishing all the data collected for a given study under complete open access, meaning no restrictions, no particular requirements or expectations in order for someone to receive access to these data, right? This is one extreme and not always appropriate. Going through just the data, the selected data set or subset that underlies a particular publication that's coming out, maybe as satisfying a journal requirement for data sharing for that particular portion of the data that are analyzed in the article, and then maybe accompanying that a timed embargo on the full data set, which sometimes can resolve the sensitivities if after a certain period of time, it's no longer seen as a problem to share the full data set. So that's another scenario. You could also imagine the data underlying a particular publication plus information about some of the other variables collected, which if released would potentially identify participants, but if just described and presented in the aggregate are maybe not a problem. So that's a combination that we often see. And then all the way to aggregate forms of the data, summaries, abstracted versions. And it's not a coincidence that I chose kind of several versions of that concept in my last bullet point on this slide, because again, with qualitative data in particular, there's no good standard definition or expectation what aggregate data from qualitative data should look like. So any of those are the kinds of materials that researchers that we work with who want to deposit some version of their data come to us and they call it, okay, here are my summary data, or here's my abstracted, field notes. And I'll give you some examples of what that looks like in the case of some published projects. And then accompanying all of that, whatever form and version of data sharing you choose as appropriate for a given study, accompanying all that, the very important metadata, which again, Sophia and Sarah both referenced, which make data more discoverable, more accessible, even if it's not, because you're not sharing, let's say in many of those scenarios, the full data set, maybe it doesn't fit the full expectation of FAIR data, that acronym, but metadata allow for whatever it is that's shared to be more discoverable and more interpretable. Next slide, please. This is kind of just a summary from some experts from the information sciences perspective who study these various versions of data sharing and how that can happen. So sort of a different presentation of the same ideas that I just talked about. But essentially, when we're talking about aggregate data, we're not talking about fully open access. We're also not talking about closed access, meaning nobody can see these data in any form outside of the research, the original research team or researcher, but we're talking about being somewhere in the middle, having some kind of mediated open access, starting with fully discoverable metadata, so the description of the data, but then having only a portion of the data and possibly also under some access restrictions. That is also another form of mediated access that could help with data sensitivity. Next slide, please. Now, why was I probably invited to be part of this discussion today as a representative of a repository, and a very kind of particular repository, because repositories are really critical. And Sophia talked about the various types of repositories that exist out there. Repositories are really critical in facilitating the appropriate sharing, even of sensitive data, by researchers like yourselves. So a lot of the things that provide protection for sensitive data, for the participants that these sensitive data were collected from, are things that an individual researcher cannot do on their own, which is why there are these infrastructure set up in the form of different specialized repositories where you can turn for assistance, for help, for even brainstorming, if you will, early on in the process about how you should both collect the data, document the data, and then potentially format them or package them for actual sharing. Again, I speak from the perspective of a fully curated repository, so not the generalist repositories that may not have curation, may not exactly fit this model. But talking to a repository representative early on in your process is something that would enable you to do things right during the course of your actual data collection, so that when you are at the end of your project and are getting ready to submit the data in compliance with the NIH and HEAL data sharing expectations, you've already taken the steps and done the things that you were supposed to in order for your data to be shareable in its most appropriate form. So why do I say that repositories are critical in this? They not only provide benefits in the form of persistent identifier and appropriate citation for the eventually shared data package, not only do they provide long-term preservation and reformatting as technologies develop, and again, the kinds of things that no researcher on their own would be doing after the end of a project, after a project is completed, but they also provide workflow-based tools, technology-based tools, and policy-based tools that enable ethical sharing, even again, of sensitive data. So things like access controls, which I already mentioned, potentially embargoes, secure downloads, data use agreements, if data use is contemplated in kind of a more restricted manner, only to people who qualify, and so on. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go to some examples. And again, I want to make the important caveat that aggregate sharing and restricted sharing is what I'm focusing on here, because this is the topic of our conversation. But this is in no way the only manner of sharing data. Again, if you think about data sharing early enough, you can prepare things in such a way, both starting with the informed consent with human participants, the appropriate formatting of the materials and so on, you can prepare things for more complete data sharing, right? You can have a more comprehensive version of the data from your project shared. Still not the raw data. I don't think that that's really almost ever appropriate with qualitative materials. But if those things didn't happen, or if for one reason or another you find yourself in a situation where you don't think that that's the appropriate form of data sharing, you can then start thinking about aggregate data sharing. So this is why I'm focusing on such examples, but I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression that this is the only way to share data, and certainly not the only way to share data with via the qualitative data repository. Next slide, please. And these are all published. You can, after the slides are shared, you can follow the citations and see more in detail what I'm talking about here. But just very quickly to give you a sense of what aggregate data might look like. So here's an example of research done on a topic related to mental health with a very small specific community, geographically specifically located, where the depositors made the following choices. They released analyzed data. So that's a form of aggregation, just having some of the resulting analyses. And then a lot of documentation of their processes and all of that parts released publicly. But then the transcripts underlying the analyses were restricted. And so there's graduated access, right? From more publicly available components to the fuller version of the transcripts being under access control. Next slide, please. So kind of the spectrum that I described already was present in that one project. So things don't even have to be on the project level. You could apply that graduated access even on the file level within a project. This is another example where the research, not from the biomedical context in this case, but you could see the kind of model that this person followed. It was a study collecting court cases. And so the discussions in the courtroom could not be fully transcribed and released, but the researcher made very detailed field notes from the court cases that she observed, only focusing on the specific variables that she was paying attention to. And so the notes are kind of already an abstraction of the actual, reality of what the data could have captured. She only really recorded the things that were pertinent to her specific preset variables, and that's what she released. So that abstracted from the broader context was not seen as problematic in terms of sensitivity and revealing details about the people participating in these court cases. Okay, next slide, please. This is two examples together, really illustrating the same model, which is, and very often applied form of aggregation of qualitative materials. Again, when the underlying starting qualitative data cannot be shared, using excerpts, coded excerpts that illustrate the specific analytic codes or themes that were applied during the analysis portion. So what in both of those cases the researchers did was they would list the code or theme that they came up with during their analysis, and then list one or more examples from the different transcripts. And again, taking it out of context is seen to be removing some of the sensitivity and clearly not revealing any of the broader personal information or stories of the different people who participated in the interviews and focus groups in these cases. And so it enhances the transparency of the research to some degree, right? It's more than nothing, but it does not present the kind of challenges to human participant confidentiality that otherwise might exist if the full transcripts were shared. And the reason why I chose two examples, even though they're very similar and presenting the same model, is because in the one on the right, you can see the same approach really organized in a spreadsheet, and because that's how the original PIs had organized their data. So they have their main code as the one column, then subcodes and sub-subcodes, child and parent codes, if you're familiar with that kind of qualitative data analysis. And then the column with the most text is where the excerpts are present. So those are all forms of how qualitative data can be presented in the aggregate form in the pursuit of greater transparency, even if all of the data cannot be shared. Next slide, please. And just to summarize and bring it back to kind of, again, the example and the experience of the types of projects that people bring to us in the qualitative data repository. And as a side note, I'm happy to say that we have 4 HEAL-funded projects in the works. None of them are published yet, which is why I couldn't give you examples from your colleagues directly, but they are in the works, and hopefully in the future time when you come to visit QDR's catalog, you'd be able to find some real-life examples from QDR as well. So our take on sharing or responsible sharing and publication of data, even sensitive data, is it should rest on explicit informed consent for data sharing, again, which is why it's so critical to start thinking about this at the planning stages of your project, so that the prospect of data sharing is discussed and explained to participants and their explicit consent is sought. Then, if necessary, de-identification of the qualitative materials, and then again, if appropriate, if necessary, applying access controls or presenting aggregate forms of the data as opposed to the full data. Sorry, next slide, please. I think this is my next one. I was just trying to remember for a second. Yes, now I'm happy to pass the presentation back to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you to Sophia Lafferty-Haas and Desi Kirilova for their insightful and practical lightning talks. So in this final part of the recorded portion of today's tutorial, we're going to quickly highlight key resources that focus on adhering to the NIH data sharing policy and completing steps outlined in the HEAL compliant checklist. Outlined here are specific HEAL requirements and NIH policy guide requirements. We'll be including these links in your email at the end of this webinar, as well as they are on our website. There are specific policies that do apply to data sharing and to data management, as well as communication acknowledgements for federal funding. We wanted to highlight 4 specific resources that we find and that we use often in HEAL consults and discussions with HEAL researchers. The first is around data management and sharing plans. We have resources and guidance on developing data management and sharing plans that align with the NIH HEAL data sharing policies and helping researchers plan for repositories as well as responsible data management throughout their project. One piece of the data management and sharing plan is that it does outline if there are exceptions to full data sharing. So if you do have sensitive data and there are limitations to what can be shared, there is explicit instructions in there for how you can outline that and explain any exceptions. The HEAL Data Repository Selection Tool is an excellent tool that is designed to help researchers select an appropriate HEAL compliant repository based on both specific data sharing needs as well as project requirements. There is a data packaging guide, which is a very detailed guide on how to step by step navigate, manage, and share HEAL compliant data effectively. It helps you walk through the steps of creating a data package that would go into a repository. And lastly, we have the HEAL semantic search resources, which are an interactive way to explore HEAL studies and related biomedical concepts to identify connections among data sets, variables, and studies in innovative ways. These connections help make and enable unique research questions and potential collaborations across the research community. On our HEAL Data Fair website, we have an extremely valuable resource, which includes the checklist of all of the steps for HEAL compliant data sharing. And there are individual resources on each one of these steps. Our tutorial next month will be going over this in detail and resources that are available for each of these steps. We also have a way for you as an interactive checklist to actually track your study's data sharing progress. And it is possible to search this by an award number and to monitor progress in real time. And lastly, we want to say that you are not alone in this process, that the HEAL stewards are available to guide and support you throughout your data sharing journey. So thank you for your time today. Here are some key takeaways around sharing data, specifically sensitive data. Making informed decisions about what to share, researchers need to carefully consider what data can be shared specifically when dealing with sensitive or identifiable information. The NIH does recognize the importance of balancing openness and ethical considerations, such as protecting sensitive information, and this is often outlined in your data management and sharing plan. When sharing raw data is not feasible, whether due to legal, ethical, or privacy concerns, researchers can still contribute by generating summary or aggregate data reports. And sharing metadata is extremely essential and part of the fair data sharing process. I will now turn the presentation back to Lizelle, who will explain how the breakout sessions will be organized.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you to Sophia and Desi for a wonderful presentation. So we will shortly stop the recording and transition into breakout rooms. So please refer to the Easy Retro board link located in the chat to see the types of questions that will be answered in each breakout room. So for a quick, brief guide on how to use the Easy Retro board, you can add ideas to the relevant columns that you plan to attend. And you can also upvote and comment on others' ideas on the Easy Retro board using the thumbs up icon and using the thought bubble to comment on someone's question. So the way we will be answering this is based off of how many upvotes there are per question. Thank you, everyone.